Welcome to the program, everyone, entitled Early American Resiliency with Agriculture. So on the line, we have a previous intern and our current intern. Maddy Zdon is currently at the Boston Athenaeum. She's a UNH grad with her Museum Studies Master's. And we'll be talking specifically about her previous research project on the year without summer in 1816. So that's going to be really interesting. We also have Eponine on the line. Pardon me, Eponine, Eponine Zhou. I hope I pronounced that right. She's a rising, correct me if I'm wrong.
It's Zhou, actually.
Zhou, pardon me. She's a rising senior at Rice University down in Houston, and she is our current intern, working virtually down in Houston, doing research. She's working on her BA Philosophy Art History, and certainly aspires to go off to a PhD program in art history. Specific to Eponine's research, we are going to talk about 18th century garden design, resiliency around before and after the American Revolution, and really culture around, circa 1802. We're doing quite a lot of research, particularly to the Walsh family that lived at Strawbery Banke, early 19th century. We also have Jay McDonald on the line. He will be doing our tech, so he'll be helping out, certainly. So let's get started. Just a little bit of intro on what will be kind of the format aspect of going ahead. So we are going to start with just a basic PowerPoint with some images to really generally talk about resiliency associated with agriculture, to set a little bit of that context up. And then we're going to get into specific questions particular to past and present research with those two projects. All right, so let's get started on a brief PowerPoint presentation, lots of images, not too many. And that'll change momentarily. All right, so just to set up a little bit of early history, a lot of physicians early on, especially eventually in Portsmouth, were being influenced by these reference materials that had been transcribed and translated for years and years and years. This is actually a version that was amended by a physician out of London, enhancing a very famous herbal, Gerard's 1597 herbal. So people arriving in Portsmouth early on were using these references that included quite a lot of medicinal information, particular to surgery and other types of issues people were having, certainly doctors and patients, those relationships. But these herbals, these references were evolving very quickly as more people discovered, and certainly as science evolved. Science really established mostly in Europe at first that influence with early America, but by the 19th century, it was very rich, that influence of science and the progress that allowed people to be resilient in many ways when it came to agricultural prosperity, certainly with technology, but the science of studying plants was very early on, allowing physicians to really evolve their practices. And we'll be talking specifically to Eponine about her current research on apothecary and a few other things, early 19th century. So very important book. One of these versions was actually owned by Hall Jackson here in Portsmouth. We'll talk a little bit about him. This is the old herbal that was amended. This is the most famous English herbal that a lot of physicians here in Portsmouth were utilizing, but this was enhanced and amended. Now the funny part of this history, I kind of find it funny. Johnson, the physician that amended this version, added quite a bit. He actually criticized this version. So I'm very interested always on the resiliency of scientific study and prosperity and developing more and more knowledge. So even early on, people were second guessing these old herbals and enhancing them, basically saying, well, we've discovered more accurate information. And this evolved all the way up into the 19th century as public health was evolving, allowing people to validate more and more while they were taking a lot of adulterated medication or really adulterated ideas when it came to novice medicine. So very interesting part of history happening early on. Next slide, please. Now, discovery early on really catalyzed how people were being resilient with new discoveries and new markets. Now, a lot of the research that we've been doing at Strawbery Banke basically explains that, you know, the colonial economy after the American Revolution, people were still locked in it, but slowly they were developing more and more independence. Even though this exploration happened very early on, it really catalyzed a lot of botanists and explorers, novice and expert, to discover more and more, which established a lot of the independent markets after the American Revolution. So this is one very famous drawing depiction of the seacoast, and it's hard to see it, but Strawbery Banke is all the way down, kind of on the left middle, if you can notice that detail. So very famous map rendered in the 1600s, but a real reflection of people discovering not only plants, but animals and different resources early on. A very, very cool map. Next slide, please. Now, this is one reference that really catalyzed quite a lot of investigation. This is one of the earliest references in books, John Josselyn of 1672. Now, even by the 19th century, and maybe even later than that, people were still referring to these early discoveries to, again, accomplish new markets around, you know, food crops, new flowers, and absolutely medicinal things that people were discovering. Beyond, you know, the animal aspects of discovering through the woods and through the ecology of New England, just a very interesting documentation early on that helped people explore more and more. But again, that evolved slowly by validating more and more as explorers, as botanists, as merchants were really accumulating the resources to gain independence more and more after the American Revolution. So very, very interesting text. You can find it digital online. Now, early seed saving in Portsmouth was one of the earliest forms of resiliency. Now, this is cranberry bean, a native bean, not to be confused with what we get cranberry juice from. This is a Native American bean. Now, certainly Europeans were trading with Native Americans and learning slowly how to really engage and connect with Native American ecology. Lots of Europeans arrived really not having those skills like the Native Americans did. So there were a lot of trading, but certainly we have this evidence of seeds that were often stored in the walls of historic homes here in Portsmouth. We don't really speculate why they were put into the walls. I would assume many reasons, just for storage amongst other things that we've found within the walls. So cranberry bean, amongst other things, were collected early on. This is actually a natural seed packet, as you see. But this allowed people to really sustain their resources, especially into the winter months. From food preservation to sustaining biodiversity, medicinal crops, and culinary crops. This was one of the earliest ways of sustaining resources and being resilient, you know, through environmental change, through the lack of resources, you know, trade routes being disrupted, wartime efforts that disrupted trade and access to resources. So early on, people were cultivating not only food crops for sustenance, but saving those resources with multiple purposes. This is another old reference that people were utilizing early in Portsmouth. This is actually the oldest reference that was reprinted over and over again into those more modern herbals that the physicians were using. So De Materia Medica goes back centuries. And then the recent reprinting that I found is 1933, but this version reprinted is from a version in the 16th century. And again, these ancient references translated over and over again, amended, enhanced as people discovered more and more. And certainly these resources allowed them to find new medicines, new foodways, just additional resources upon that discovery and exploration more and more. Very interesting text. Now, sometimes we'll go into particular evidence that validates what we at first kind of speculate and assume. This is actually a probate inventory of the Sherburne family, specific, I believe, this Joseph's in the 18th century, Joseph Sherburne. Now, I don't know if everyone can notice, but the two items that I find mostly interesting on this probate, this is actually just part of it in the 18th century, is the large spinning wheel and the cider. Now, spinning your own textiles as opposed to bringing those raw materials, we do have evidence. We don't want to speculate that they had to spin most of their textiles, but a very interesting line item here that really reflects people utilizing their own resources, whether buying that in, but very interesting. But more interesting, I think, is the cider. Now, one resiliency aspect of foodways at this time was getting your harvest through the winter. So cider, being sweet, was certainly fermented as well to hydrate your family very safely. So hard cider was very common at this time, fermenting beverages, pickling, smoking and drying, salt fish, for instance, salt cod, amongst other things. So really nice reflections here on the probate. Preserving the harvest, like I said, very important throughout Portsmouth. Resiliency, certainly all the way up to victory gardens during the wartime efforts of the 20th century. This was essential. So this was a large part of family life. Whether you're a small family or large family, you were eating pickles very early on. Dill right next to it, associated with all sorts of different recipes with pickling, is not only for flavoring, but also a preservative. So dill, amongst other spices like coriander and peppercorn and allspice and all sorts of other things, not only offered flavor and medicine very often, but certainly adding shelf life. So again, connecting to these foodways traditions really reflected quite a lot of early American or colonial period resiliency around sustaining your harvest. So very interesting. So we'll be making pickles very soon at Strawbery Banke. Now, hybridization of plants was another form of creating new markets early on in America. This is actually our native strawberry, Fragaria virginiana. So Strawbery Banke is named because of the English impression of strawberry growing on the bank of the Piscataqua River. Ironically, this kind of reflected the abundance of resources early on, but people got the wrong impression that strawberries existed, all the time. And many people arriving here, they thought they would last forever. So a lot of people started to breed out the wildness to cultivate more and more of these wild species into more manageable species for new markets. We actually grow a very unique heirloom called Marshall strawberry, which was one of the first available strawberries later on, certainly beyond the colonial period, that people had access to that was a little bit easier to cultivate and sustain as opposed to these wild species that were often eaten by animals before Europeans or other settlers could actually get to them. So hybridization of plants was certainly part of agricultural resiliency, not only providing more resources, but certainly new markets, especially for the merchants and locals alike. Comfrey is a very interesting plant that was sent back to Europe and hybridized and then brought back for first aid applications. So comfrey actually grows in our Sherburne garden, our 1695 kitchen garden, and it was hybridized because it actually has cyanide in it. So a lot of early science was manipulating plant breeding to be a little bit more resilient around what was safe to apply as medicine. So at first, this kind of wild plant was just loaded with cyanide, which is very poisonous to us, and it was sent back to Europe, crossed so it would dilute a little bit of that cyanide, brought back to America and utilized quite a bit as herbal bandages or poultices. This plant regenerates cell formation. So it was commonly known as bone knit or knit bone. So because it literally brings tissue back together. Such a cool plant. But hybridization, certainly developing new species, but also chemically, people were manipulating those genetics a little bit to actually use them for, human consumption. But mostly this is topical. Now, animal husbandry was certainly part of resiliency associated with agriculture. If you had farmland, you had animals. Everything was symbiotic in early American farms, just systematic approaches. This is Hog Island sheep, one of the first introductions of sheep. And certainly this picture is brought from Mount Vernon. But these reflections of old animals and the evolution of how different animals were bred, not only for wool, but for meat, sustaining certain biodynamics on farms like manures and other things, seed production, all sorts of very, very cool dynamics associated with breeding animals all the way up into the 19th century, where certain animals were actually featured at fairs and shows, but breeding really catalyzed quite a lot of agricultural prosperity. And it certainly started with some of the early introductions of these types of sheep and other animals. Now, farm technology was certainly connected to the resiliency associated with farms. This is Jefferson moldboard plow that certainly revolutionized part of the evolution of technology on farms. Okay, I'm getting a little bit of feedback. So this is a rendering drawing of Jefferson's plow. There's many versions of this image, but very interesting kind of catalyst to a lot of additional farm technology. In fact, John Deere really evolved based on these kind of precursors of very modern technologies around farm equipment, tractors, implements. So very interesting part of the 18th century with a lot of farm technology coming out, including someone called Jethro Tull, who was designing new seeders and just new implements. So it just all came together and really evolved things by the 19th century, later 19th century. Very cool image. Now, utilizing tobacco in many ways, we certainly know that common use of tobacco as just a crop, a cash crop for smoking and chewing tobacco and all sorts of things. But a lot of people aren't familiar with the fact that farmers were using plants in innovative ways that were brand new to a lot of farmers. This was actually put into a pesticide. It was kind of one of the first forms of organic pesticide. We can debate that all we want, but technically organic. People were actually burning tobacco as well beyond the sprays. Their crops underneath maybe a blanket or some type of early tarp where you would smoke your crops to basically create an insecticide. So very, very innovative ways to not only grow cash crops, but utilizing them to control pests early on farms. This was one of the earliest pesticides, just utilizing Nicotia rustica, which is one of our heirloom species of tobacco. Now, the steam engine certainly evolved quite a bit of the factories that eventually went in, certainly around Lowell and Massachusetts, and working their way up the factories, the textile factories, eventually here in New Hampshire. So quite a lot of research around the technology that allowed textiles and raw materials to certainly come from large plantations large farms, certainly here, mostly wool amongst other textiles, certainly cotton eventually with the railroad being established, coming up, those raw materials. We eventually became the manufacturing hub, and new technology allowed us to manufacture quite a bit of these raw materials coming in with efficiency more and more. There were certainly a lot of problems with that evolution, but the steam engine and eventually fuel combustion engines really evolved our way of being resilient with certainly competing with large markets. Even shipping plants internationally was for a while very challenging, and they would come up with different innovative designs to actually ship live plants internationally. Now, this allowed people to access more of these natural resources, and certainly natural resources that may have been coming from exotic areas, if you could afford them. Certainly, it all depended on, you know, low-income families versus people who had lots of resources, like the merchant families here in Portsmouth. But very interesting picture. For a while, people had a lot of trouble internationally trading plants. They would, you know, open up those compartments and everything's rotten. Maybe there's a snake or a spider in there, or rats or something. Lots of problems over time, but more and more innovative ways of really being resilient around accessing natural resources that you might not be able to grow in your own region. So very interesting picture. I guess it's a drawing, actually. Now, Portsmouth Navy Shipyard circa 1800. This is an interesting picture. By that turn of the century, people were really evolving. Certainly the timber and fish market was still predominantly controlling the local market, but more and more of these independent markets were developing slowly as we gain more access to natural resources, more trade routes, and certainly that had to do with the merchants accessing more and more exotics, those introductions, but certainly just in general, accessing raw materials, bringing them back, and certainly processing when feasible through that manufacturing era that evolved certainly into the 1830s, but very interesting depiction of kind of the beginning age of a prosperous Portsmouth, prosperous nation a few years after the American Revolution. Now, I absolutely love this painting by John Bartlett. Very, very unique. So in this picture entitled America Guided by Wisdom, America is actually represented by a woman sitting down there with the American flag, and lots of symbolism and iconography around basically the gods of agriculture and commerce. So very interesting depiction that basically the artist intended to reflect prosperity, some reflection on Western expansion in here, but a lot of symbolism around the catalyst of independence and prosperity around commerce and agriculture. Very, very cool. I wish I had a print of this on my wall. Another depiction a little bit later on. This is Merchant Row in Portsmouth, and really kind of a reflection of certainly the boats evolving, but this was kind of the hub of trade. In fact, the next slide we'll see is Market Square a little bit later than this depiction, but more and more trade with commerce, certainly all our surpluses. You know, it could have been a bushel of potatoes. It could have been an acre of potatoes. We're sustaining ourselves more and more with surpluses going out to international trade. Some of those resources stayed here, but most of it was going out to the ships and certainly bringing in more raw materials into early America as well. Love this pic. This is down by Black Trumpet, if you're familiar with this area of Portsmouth. There's Market Square a little bit later on. Market Square is named because it was a farmer's market, along with bringing trade and surplus closer to the docks, where the ships would take a lot of the surplus out for international trade. So I love this depiction. I actually live right around the corner, a couple blocks from here, but really kind of a reflection of prosperity as we were gaining more independence, more new independent markets, and certainly connections to our farms. But unfortunately, not many people had farm jobs. Let's say by 1815, I think I saw it was maybe 1 to 2% of Portsmouth residents actually had farm jobs. Certainly as the 19th century went on, a lot of people went into the factories for jobs, minus the southern plantations a bit south of New Hampshire and generally New England, with exceptions, there are. Now, like I said, one of the best examples in American history when it comes to agricultural resiliency, especially within local communities, is the Victory Garden era. I say that loosely because we're kind of in now a Victory Garden era as we renew these traditions of growing for ourselves, as maybe we're limited on resources. So Victory Gardens actually started as early as World War I, and certainly very popular by the Second World War. This is our very lush Victory Garden a couple of years ago, and we grow quite a lot of those products, that produce, medicinal crops, but mostly veggies and fruits that would have been available at that time. But at that time, there was a lot of community saving of seed, trading of resources. Maybe your neighbor had eggs, you had tomatoes. So resiliency was not only growing resources, but connecting to your neighbors, to your community in many different systematic ways. So if you do want the best example to kind of learn more and more about resiliency and certainly our connections to growing resources now, it's certainly Victory Gardens that are beginning to be more and more renewed, this tradition, which kind of is synonymous with community gardens at this point. Maybe not the same crops, but very interesting tradition. Now we're going to get into a little bit of questions particular to Eponine's research, particular to the apothecary traditions here in Portsmouth. Now this is Digitalis purpurea that was actually researched by Hall Jackson and a few of his colleagues that were still in Europe. Hall Jackson, 18th century, was one of our earliest physicians, and researching scientifically plants and their usage and their practicality with surgery and different ailments was certainly a nice evolution of resiliency around public health. Certainly evolving very, very quickly by the late 19th century with toxicology and pharmacology. So we grow this every now and then, and I'll actually show you Hall Jackson's house coming up, but we'll get into some specific questions about that research coming up with Eponine's current research. So on the left, this is breadseed poppy or medicinal poppy. We've actually validated that at least one physician here in Portsmouth, Lyman Spalding, was growing poppy that was often utilized for extractions and certain things for pain relief. These types of extractions were also on the shelves of apothecary shops here in Portsmouth very, very often for a few years, certainly until Prohibition. Because it was based with alcohol, those extractions. Now, next to the poppy picture, this is Hall Jackson's home that used to be on the corner of Court Street and Washington Street. If you're familiar with where the Temple Israel is, this house was basically right in the parking lot, that lower parking lot, right around the corner from Strawbery Banke. And Hall Jackson, with his friend William Withering, was researching quite a bit about the efficacy of Digitalis purpurea, and then certainly other doctors kind of experimenting with medicinal poppy as well. So a very, very cool validation of a little bit of practice of cultivation when it comes to medicinal crops. So as opposed to buying it in, which many people were, people started to grow their own medicine, certainly for more independence, but certainly accessing these medicinal resources a lot easier as opposed to trade. Now, one of the greatest parts of our program currently is our seed program. Now, early on, people were collecting seed, and now we collect seed to really sustain not only our garden designs, but to sustain the resources that our neighbors and our community members have. So year round, we grow lots of seed and not only sustain our own garden designs, but give that away at no cost to school programs, private gardeners, just really anyone who wants access to that seed. And that really kind of connects us to the evolution of resiliency around foodways and medicine, sustaining our own resources within our own local communities. And this is certainly a connection to early independence, gaining independence through our own seed companies, as opposed to really relying on that old colonial economy and just buying in from other parts of the world. So that really catalyzed quite a lot of independence with our own seed markets here in early America. And that really evolved quite quickly. On the right is actually our smear method, some of our own seed collection that we did a couple years ago. And we are currently collecting now. Anyone is interested, just let us know. Next, I think that's it, Jay. Excellent. All right, everyone. So I am going to get into a few questions particular to Maddy's research, and we'll just run through these particular to her report on a year without summer. Now, to give you just a basic feedback on that historic event, it was basically in 1816, and in the spring, people expected, summer, the season to come like a regular thing, like our regular seasonality, but more and more snow came, less and less temperature came, and people really got into a lot of trouble. Correct me if I'm wrong, I'll certainly talk to you, Maddy. You might be a little bit more familiar, but I read a statistic in your report that said maybe 50% of produce decreased. Is that right? Or am I misquoting you?
Yeah, so in the year 1816, there's a lot of reports, whether it be in newspapers or people's personal journals, especially the farmers, that whether it be grasses, hay, produce, was very quote unquote light. So you can take that kind of and spin it any way you'd like it. But if a farmer, is saying that their produce was light that year, it probably was, slashed in a significant way to the point where their livelihood is potentially threatened. So
very cool. Well, not cool. I also noticed that you did a little bit of research on the access of Shaker seed at that time. Correct me if I'm wrong. So the Shakers were one of the first, peoples to actually establish independent seed distribution throughout the country. And I was just curious if you came across that in your research, particular to hard times and people's access to seed. I mean, without climate, how do they grow it, really?
Exactly, and I think that's what's really, really tough. I think one thing that inspired me to talk about the year without summer, which is directly related to Mount Tambora and its eruption, and essentially gas and rock and dust flying up into our atmosphere. And excuse me, I'm not a scientist, but flying up into our atmosphere, and essentially all of that kind of encases the globe and reflects off light. So, light, sunlight, and heat does not get, to our soils appropriately. And during this time, whether you save seeds or not, it wasn't the issue of saving seeds or planting them at a particular time. It was actually the weather that was the issue. And then during this year in 1816 and in New England, and I read as far down south as South Carolina and other places, because it was definitely a global thing. It just didn't happen in America or Indonesia where the volcano was. It happened in Europe and Asia, everywhere. Essentially, there was frosts in May, which is, I think even in our own lifetimes, we've experienced a few frosts in maybe May, but there was also a few frosts in June, a few frosts in July, and a few frosts in August, which is really detrimental to fruit growing in New England, to hay, to grasses. Snow is really, really detrimental to what we eat and what our at the time what our animals, our power sources kind of ate. So essentially, from my perspective and my research, it didn't matter how many seeds you kind of saved, or what you planned to plant in your own garden, if there was frost kind of destroying any effort that you made. So.
And I think that's a good segue into seafood, because I find that extremely interesting part of your research, where if people couldn't rely on terrestrial food, land-based food, they shifted to seafood. And correct me if I'm wrong, those prices went down, which I believe they're doing now, like currently.
Yeah. So Portsmouth is in a beautiful location, beautiful place right on the seacoast. So they kind of have two places to kind of search for food. And although more interior New Hampshire does have its rivers and its ponds, the ocean really it provides a lot. Again, you look at that, what was it? The American Guided by Wisdom by John Bartlett that you showed earlier, and you see at the goddess's feet, she has, food spilling out of her bucket and stuff like that. And I think we can kind of look toward the ocean and see that same thing. But the year of 1816 was particularly interesting in regards to what people ate and what they caught, as fish are very kind of temperamental in that kind of way, that the temperature of the water it alters their spawning, it alters where they go, how deep they are, if you can catch them on the coast or further out. And during this year, all the normal alewives and herrings and stuff that people were eating, and that includes higher classes and lower classes of people, they kind of dove into the same fish. They weren't where they usually were, essentially. They weren't being caught. And essentially those particular fish, the prices of alewives and herrings kind of went up. But they also called this year the year of the mackerel, or mackerel year, because mackerel were really popular because they could simply be caught and they were on the market. So mackerel flooded the Portsmouth, and I'm sure Dover and Durham and all these places kind of on the coast, those markets, and the price kind of bottomed out on them, just because there's a lot of supply, and of course a lot of demand, but a lot more supply than there was, I think, demand at the time.
That's so cool, because I think it relates to this presentation is certainly intended to kind of relate to our current challenges. And I've recently heard, because farmers are not doing so hot right now. But I also hear that the prices of seafood are going down. So I immediately try to make that connection to this historic event. And it's quite different, certainly, but very interesting. In fact, back to the volcano, were New Englanders aware that the volcano had erupted, or were they just kind of confused on that environmental change? They didn't really know what was going on.
Yeah, so Mount Tambora is in Indonesia, so it is thousands upon thousands upon thousands of miles away. And if we kind of situate ourselves back 200 years ago to 1815, 1816, although there were centers of communication that were evolving, particularly with newspapers and all that kind of stuff, usually news could only go as fast as your feet did, or your horse's feet did, or a ship did. So people knew of Mount Tambora and that it erupted. Although it wasn't a popular thing to report on in the Portsmouth or even Dover or even Keene news at the time, it was something that was in the newspapers. However, there wasn't that connection that this volcano, that it exploded, and that there was, within the next 17 months, a dip in temperature, and a dip that affected everyone around the globe and also affected the food supplies. However, what's particularly interesting is during this time, you also need to kind of consider who could read and who had access to news. So I think that's really, really important to think about. in regards to, you know, did everyone know? Did everyone in Portsmouth know? I'm not really sure if everyone knew. In addition to that, Portsmouth at this time was going through a few different challenges, social challenges and everything like that, economic challenges that possibly trumped this volcano thousands of miles away erupting, which is really interesting.
Very interesting. And certainly at that time, there was a lot of food insecurity that you mentioned in your paper. I mean, food insecurity throughout the centuries, but food insecurity on top of environmental change had to have been significant at that time.
Yeah.
Low-income families, you know, struggling even without the environmental change. So I'm curious on how really people were fighting food insecurity as we are now. I mean, it's happened throughout the centuries, and I always ask people if they have different ideas on progress against that food insecurity. I always call it food sovereignty. Everyone has access to the resources that we all depend on.
Yeah, so it's really romantic, right, to go into a historic house or go to somewhere like Strawbery Banke and look at all the beautiful gardens and say, wow, this is how people survive, this is how they live, the amount of work it takes to put, you know, to grow a victory garden. I firsthand know how much work it takes, or even just a portion of what it takes. But it's really, really important, again, and I like how you brought that up, to mention food insecurity. And food insecurity doesn't just affect certain people at certain times. It affects a lot of people at a lot of different times. It's not just 1816 or 1815, which is the years that I'm talking about where food insecurity hit Portsmouth. Simply not true. However, it's funny because I kind of connect it to what we're kind of experiencing today. When we all walked into our grocery stores or corner markets or something like that, and we didn't see toilet paper on the shelves, what did we do? And that's something that's really beautiful about humans, is that we adapt, and we're really, really good at adapting. So again, it's making sure that we focus on the things that aren't necessarily popular, such as mackerel, or eating ugly foods, or kind of what we like to consider ugly foods that have spots or something like that, that we necessarily wouldn't pick up at the grocery store, and making sure that we're not heavily impacting one resource at a time, and that we're kind of spreading out what we can take, and what resources we can, and understanding what resources we can take from and use in multiple different ways. So
we could have a whole program, I would think, on food security, food sovereignty. It's very interesting. Last but not least, you know, then, now, what are your thoughts on solutions when it comes to, I mean, how are people really engaging with solutions at that time? Very similar, I would expect, to how we're dealing with it, you know, with just accessing more resources or finding more innovations on sustaining resources. Can you talk a little bit on that?
yeah, so solutions, I feel like we don't really understand our solutions until years after an event,
Right.
or years after whatever may happen. But what is really interesting, is the fact that, I'm trying to figure out how to say this in an appropriate way, that we are really resilient, and that we try and continue to figure out ways to kind of figure out where we go from here. And I feel it's interesting because in 1815, 1816, the overwhelming cause, or kind of a scapegoat, for lack of a better word, for the weather, was blaming it on God, or saying that God was angry. This higher power was angry at us for some reason, and we need to kind of fix our ways, or do something, go to church more, do this, to kind of fix what we kind of did. Again, it wasn't looking at what we know today, science, as Mount Tambora gases, dust, everything like that, encircling the globe, refraction of light, no heat. It was definitely, God is angry, we need to do something about it. And I'm not sure how many people believe that, didn't believe that. We're looking at the science, we're reading, you know, the latest in reports from Tambora and everything like that. But it's really, really interesting to see how we kind of process through these times, how we process through a pandemic, how we process through an internship at Strawbery Banke, how we process through food insecurity, and knowing that humans do adapt pretty well, as we probably wouldn't be here on a Zoom meeting, on a Zoom call if we didn't, is really reassuring. So.
And I kind of think that sometimes humans need to be at the precipice of certain challenges to actually shift and pivot like this.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of tragic what we're going through, but it seems like we're now recognizing, you know, what's more important than others. And I would expect some of that happened early on as well, but just not sure.
Yeah.
But we often need this like just huge challenge to kind of pivot and think differently.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
it's been kind of good at the same time. I don't know how else to say that.
Yeah, one of my favorite quotes that came out of this project and this research on Mount Tambora, year of without summer, and looking at, you know, how New Hampshire responded was, there was a newspaper that was around in the early 1800s. It was called The Intelligencer. And on July 18th, 1816, I pulled a quote from one of their articles, and it says, "A famine for man and beast seems to stare us in the face." It's really interesting how humans react when problems, adversities, you know, these things we're trying to hurdle over do stare us in the face. What's our first reaction? How do we process after that reaction? And what's the eventual solution? How do we come to it? Do we see it years later? Do we immediately see it? It's really, really interesting.
That's very interesting. I'm sure we can talk on and on. Did I miss any particular aspect of that research that you might want to discuss or mention?
No, I think we had a good conversation. I think it was covered pretty well. I know for anyone listening, there's a bunch of information out there on the general kind of effects of the year without summer. So a simple Google search if you want to get into the science of Mount Tambora or anything like that that we didn't cover here. It's really, really accessible and anyone can access it. So.
Awesome. Thank you, Maddy.
Mm-hmm.
So
Hello. Let's get into some of your research.
sure.
So I think I just did a bit of a spiel on this, but again, Eponine and I have been researching quite a bit on the medicinal resources, garden design, certainly trying to validate more and more around our research on Kieran Walsh and his family that did live at Strawbery Banke.
Yeah.
And our date is circa 1802. So we've been trying to just kind of target more and more of that validation around that time. But particular questions I had for you, Eponine, we've been talking quite a bit on this. For instance, we've been talking a lot about how Virginia was influencing merchants, influencing people to design their landscapes in particular ways, but certainly, you know, Jefferson, amongst others, were influencing a lot of the country to follow suit in different ways. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So Virginia was basically like the political center of America at that time, and Jefferson, Washington are like they're like the presidents, or you know, they're basically the political leaders, and they also like lead they have like a huge influence on people than like on horticulture and garden design. And yeah, there's definitely like they're still like influenced by English landscape gardening, which which was like popular in England and also in America at that time. So even though like there's like the like the there's like the independence and then the war, they still like get lots of inspirations from English garden design at that time. So like yeah, so definitely like they help to spread like that kind of kind of naturalistic landscape like by capability brown and that type of thing. Also I guess that's a big influence. And also speaking of like more relevant to Strawbery Banke and the Wash family. So like so Strawbery Banke, there's not really like landscaping gardens. So it's more like a small merchant type of garden. So in that aspect, so like especially Jefferson, he has like a whole like two whole books of like records on his like farming and his like horticulture. Like he like kept very detailed diaries about like the plants that he grew and then the animals he raised and all kinds of like sort of trivial details like how he just like send exchange seeds and plants with other people, or he bought some sort of like maybe fruit plants or like kind of plant from somebody else. And so like he does like lots of the gardening thing on his own, and of course he owned slaves at that time. And and so he was very into cultivating like plants. Many of them are like have some practical purposes, and then like spread the seeds around America. And he tries to like he's more like leaning towards the idea that Americans should be able to sustain themselves like without like relying on like international trade, basically trade with the British people at that time. And there's still lots of trade going on, and like Jefferson tried to like enforce the embargo in 1807, but it wasn't really successful. So like American people at that time still like rely heavily on trade, but still like there's like an emphasis on like growing your own plants and with like practical plants and just working the garden. So focusing on agriculture, husbandry, and horticulture. So yeah,
And
definitely.
that last point I find the most interesting when, researching more and more about Jefferson, the agrarian philosophy that he had that a lot of people disagreed with. And that's why we're kind of in a capitalistic, market economy now, going beyond that original like subsistence and the philosophy when it came to the idea that our own local economies can sustain our own resources without the larger task of international trade. I just find fascinating. But unfortunately, he lost that battle very early on, it seems. So more and more, just very interesting to dig into that content. So very cool. And Eponine, we've been discussing a lot on, generally we haven't, found a lot of information on how people were designing their gardens and landscapes early on, with a few exceptions when it comes to large property owners. But we kind of think more and more, certainly still speculating, that these larger plantations in the South, people that were commonly communicating, different innovative ways with farm tech and exotic species, were influencing the merchants, small and large, here in Portsmouth. Do you get that impression?
Yeah, of course, the North and South are like they've been like interacting and sustaining each other for a long time. And then the North is basically more like a center for like industry and that kind of manufacturing and then the south is more like, well, basically they grow more crops there because of the weather. They like have like cotton and wheat, and I kind of saying that's like those like essential like food sources to sustain the north and also to sustain the manufacture in the north. So yeah, definitely there's like a like huge connection between the north and south, and the north sort of has to like rely on the production of south, to some extent. Although they also grow crops there like corns and like kind of things.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I know a lot of those grains, were coming in, those raw materials, and some of our mills here in Portsmouth is actually shifting into like grist manufacturing, just actually grinding it down to cornmeal. Most of it was textiles, but some of them started to shift or add and enhance their inventories to actually grind grain. And certainly as more and more of those plantations were producing those raw materials and shipping them here and there, it's very interesting as we kind of pivoted to incorporate new grains, or at least the manufacturing of grains in certain ways. Very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
One of our oldest mills that I believe was also a grist mill is right around the corner of Strawbery Banke. If everyone is familiar with where Saunders Market is, that was one of our original mills, which is just a couple blocks from Strawbery Banke.
Mm-hmm.
So we talked about the southern plantations in Virginia. Let's get into some medicinal history, which is very interesting.
Yeah.
So we actually just let's get into that poppy cultivation just for a moment. So Eponine, we came across this letter correspondence in between two medical professionals.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I think Nancy is on the line. She actually did the research. Thank you, Nancy. We found a correspondence between Lyman Spalding and another medical professional. Basically, this medical professional was asking Lyman Spalding to send him poppy seeds. So for a few years now, we've been kind of guessing a little bit on, at first these apothecary products were bought in before a lot of people started to make their own concoctions here in early America. So I just find it absolutely fascinating that we actually validated that. So Eponine, do we think that more of the doctors were probably doing that? I mean, we don't want to speculate too much, but finding this one doctor that was growing medicinal crops, I almost want to lean towards that, speculation that a lot of doctors may have been growing their own produce in their own yards, but maybe not.
Yeah.
What's your impression?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question, and we might not be able to find, direct like sources, evidence showing that, for example, digitalis was grown in Portsmouth, in the early 19th century, and it's probably just hard to find like written records for that. But I do think, first of all, there's inevitably speculation in this kind of research questions. Right. And since people growing opium and poppy, and then I feel like it's very likely because like poppy, it's like kind of has nice flowers and also has medicinal value, and it's also the same for digitalis. It's the foxglove, purple foxglove has, I remember, has also been recorded as like a aesthetic plant and as well as a medicinal plant. So in that case, I think they're kind of, these two types of plants are similar, and it's likely that if one was grown in somebody's garden, and the other one could also be growing in somebody's garden. So I definitely see there's like similar cases, and maybe people would, even if not for the well, not mostly for the medicinal value. They might grow it for, just aesthetic purposes. And they do grow lots of like aesthetic plants at that time. So yeah, so I would say like it's fair, like reasonable speculation to say that people at that time grow like digitalis. And so, but it's a sort of like open end question because I really doubt you can find like a very direct evidence saying they grow it. But I think it's a good guess anyway.
Everyone, when we started to research, particular to the Walsh family, one of the like first things I did or tried to do was validate property lines and the amount of landscape that family had, and to certainly compare it to other families in Portsmouth, just practically kind of questioning how much area people had to actually grow beyond the farms that were more inland versus the seacoast. A lot of our South End right now, there's just little tiny pocket gardens with property lines. So part of that investigation is just kind of logically thinking about, what would have been practical for a merchant family or someone owning the apothecary store or just having limited space, as opposed to relying on larger farms in other areas to actually cultivate those ingredients. We do know by the 19th century that the apothecaries were inviting people to bring produce in to extract. So maybe someone had burdock or something else growing in their landscape. The apothecaries, eventually by the 19th century, were inviting them to just bring plants in to those shops. They would do the concoction chemistry-wise with a few methods, and then you would bring that concoction home. But as early as the Walsh interpretation, we know that there was house calls associated with the early physicians, early doctors. So possibly they were bringing these concoctions, these medicinal aspects, directly to people. One particular research aspect of the Walsh family, just to let everyone know, is dropsy or edema, which was a very common ailment. Edema is basically when tissue saturates, gets filled with liquids. Very similar to everyone, if you're familiar with edema in plants, if you water them too much, they kind of rot on you. But that really initially kind of started this research more and more to kind of answer these questions. We did find a map of Walsh's properties. He actually had a few. The house right now has moved slightly from its original location. But looking at that, including South End properties, very limited space. So we've been trying to validate more and more on how these families had access to these particular medicines. Was it house calls? Very possible. Before hospitals were really established, there was quite a lot of house calls before public health really evolved. So it's very interesting. So we talked about the correspondence and experimentation. Eponine, did you read a little bit into how the doctors, that one reference that we're using quite a bit, and I can actually show you a picture of this book if everyone is interested, particular to the medicinal history of Portsmouth. Did you get into any of the content based on how the doctors were researching the efficacy of these plants? Because it took quite a lot of time to really validate how things worked. So in the 19th century, as early as the early 1800s, people were experimenting. They knew things worked, but they didn't know how it worked. Did you get into that, Eponine?
Yeah, so that book, I believe you're talking about the 1802 book. That's
Yeah, let me go actually get that. I'll be right back, everyone.
Okay, should I?
No, keep going. I'm right here.
So yeah, that book, you can access it for free online. There's like a, digitized
I wish I could just share my screen. Looks backwards to me, but this is an awesome book.
Yeah, so we mentioned, I remember there's a book with records, actually probably more than one book that mentions there's like the usage of pills and infusion is a very big thing that they use to like process the purple foxglove and make it into a medicine for curing the dropsy. And then like it's quite interesting. There's some of the doctors like Howard Jackson would and Withering would write down like specific cases, like they discuss the details of the patient, like their age, or their like health condition, and like so like they give suggestions like take like a pill in the morning and like take infusion in the evening, and then like seems like I don't know if there are other ways, but like the most mentioned like method for like curing dropsy is to take a pill or an infusion sometimes, and or infusion like of digitalis. And yeah, and the dosage is like different, like from different for different people. And yeah, so that book I remember has lots of like records like of like how different patients like take this certain amount of pill or infusion or both, and then like after how many days, like how their symptoms have been relieved or nothing happened or they died. Well, they're pretty like honest about like they're more like sort of like experimental, I guess, because like it took them a while to like figure out like the correct like dosage for digitalis, because if it's like too high, if the dosage is too high, it's actually like very could be fatal and like could be very dangerous. Yeah, so that they have to like experiment like with like different things, and sometimes it works, sometimes it just doesn't, because like they didn't know them, but like there's like different like kind of dropsy like caused by different things. It's only the one that's caused by the heart, the kind of cardiovascular type of dropsy that actually can be relieved or cured by digitalis. But there are other types. But at that time they thought the digitalis could like make you like because when you have dropsy you have that kind of like bloating, like they believe there's like water that stay in your body that makes you like that kind of symptom. And then they believe digitalis could like get rid of those kind of water in your body, but actually it has like an effect on the heart, like which is like the cause of a certain type of dropsy. So yeah, it's very interesting. They talk about like basically how they use dropsy, the different dosage and like different forms of medicine. So yeah.
And I guess that's the connection that we've been making, kind of connecting to resiliency when it comes to medicine. At first, like you said, they had certain impressions that digitalis did certain things, and they were completely wrong in the beginning. And it took more investigation to validate how these new medicines actually worked in the body, how it aided in getting liquid out of the system. At first, they thought it was actually a function of the liver to actually detoxify the body, everyone, but it was really to strengthen the heart muscle to actually pump more effectively to get toxins out of the system. So science really evolved in that way. So one of many reflections of how people were evolving public health by investigating more and more with these experiments. This, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Eponine, the research started in the 18th century and really evolved into the early 1800s, right?
Yeah, I think it's in the about 1760s when there's like first discussion by Withering or somebody else. They first discovered the effect of digitalis, and they like experienced it on 11 patients, and then keep a record of every different 11 cases. And then later, so it started in England, I believe. And then this so information from England like traveled to America fairly quick. Like after just a couple years, then it just arrived in America. And then Hal Jackson is like and he lives in Portsmouth, and he's the main figure who promotes the usage of like digitalis to cure dropsy. So he's like a key figure and like one of the most important doctor who like who discovered and promoted digitalis. So
Mhm.
yeah, that's definitely like a transatlantic connection in that aspect. And it's like from 1760 to about 1790, it becomes like very popular already, the use of digitalis. So and later on, it's being practiced in the early 19th century and later.
It's interesting. We do have a couple questions particular to this research, Eponine.
Mm-hmm.
Someone is curious on what primary sources we used.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, so primary sources, I can't really pull out, I need to actually find the exact source, but that we've already mentioned the writings about digitalis by Hall Jackson himself. That's like, then lots of them are like quoted or, just, quoted in the book called Hall Jackson and the Purple Foxglove, that book. That book is like it's a secondary source, but like it has like lots of primary sources like embedded. So yeah, one of these, and then another very important source I believe we've mentioned is the 1802 book. It's not really a book. It's more like a pamphlet, like a short. I need to remember. It's I don't quite remember the title, but it focused just only on the digitalis and its cure for dropsy. So it's a very specific book. I can look for it later if you want to find it. I might even be able to provide a link to that book.
Yeah, it just looked like we had a question that came in. Someone was curious on which primary sources we were using. And it wasn't the 1800 book. It wasn't this book that I was showing everyone. This is another resource that we've been using, more of the medicinal history, but yeah, we've definitely used a few. Would you, Eponine, you want to mention William Bartram?
Oh yeah, William Bartram, and John Bartram, their father and son, and they're very popular and famous early American horticulturalists, and they work mostly in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and then they have lots of they basically are like they get lots of seeds and like breeds like new species, and they got lots of seeds from England. And then they import them to the US. They also have like a whole business going on. Like they would get seeds for people maybe like Jefferson, all kinds of wealthy people, and they would like cultivate like plants from England and all around the world. It's not just England, but like international seeds, and they would cultivate them like in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and then they would spread them around like to places like New England, Portsmouth, and all around the country basically. And they're like, and also they will help to breed new species. They also have their own like records. Like there's primary sources written by these two, and also secondary sources, but they're very influential at that time, and they did like introduce many probably not digitalis exactly. I don't believe it's, but there are many like plants that's introduced in American that's like they imported them. So yeah.
And certainly a lot of those references with our, regional speculation on how those horticulturists, large influencers on the Portsmouth, practice, whether it's daily life or medicinal practice. The second question is, how does Lyman Spalding's work on opium poppy relate to the Walsh family?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. And again, there's like speculation, lots of speculation in that story. I feel like Nancy might be able to provide more details because she like looked through the whole archive. But based on what I have seen, because I'm working remotely, I can't really like access as many resources as she does. So yeah, based on what I've seen, it's like so like he's basically a doctor in the same area, and he's growing like medicinal plants. So again, I said it's some sort of speculation. We feel like it's possible, like if the Walsh family ever like had a garden, they could like grow some medicinal plants that could have like that could cure the illness of Mrs. Walsh, or they could have some commercial value. Yeah, again, it's we don't know for sure. It's a kind of saying that you just probably can't find the direct evidence, but you can probably just speculate and form a theory on it.
And part of that speculation is knowing that one doctor may have been cultivating and using poppy for pain relief. That's what they were growing it for, those extractions. It would be likely that other doctors were using that tincture, that extraction for relieving pain in their patients. So while we don't have direct evidence that the Walsh family was using it, there's quite a lot of evidence in Portsmouth, whether through the doctors or through the apothecary shops early on, that people had access to laudanum. So, but as your point explained, it is still a bit of speculation, but reasonable speculation.
Yeah.
Those are two good questions. Thank you for whoever asked those. Eponine, have I not gone through any of the subjects that you might be interested in talking about, particular to your research? Have we not mentioned anything?
I feel like we have mentioned all the topic that's on the list. We mentioned trade and revolution, economy, war. Yeah. Let's see. And also medicine. I feel like that's basically like I feel like I've talked about almost everything. Yeah.
At this point, I'd love to just open up any type of discussion particular to how we're resilient today. If anyone relates to any of these historical themes, certain things that they may connect to, certain things that you might be doing in your own garden, or just general resiliency, we can certainly talk about, a bit of a learning curve with the virtual internship that we've designed this year, with some challenges and a lot of successes. That is certainly part of resiliency, if anyone wants to speak on that subject.
Erik, we did have a couple other questions come in.
Okay, we can do those first.
So on the topic of resiliency, actually, someone asked, when did Portsmouth economy change from reliance on independent markets to reliance on the labor of enslaved people? And how does this reality fit into the concept of resiliency in the community? Because there is a bit of a dichotomy between those concepts.
So how quickly it evolved past into independence? Was the first portion?
Right, reliance on independent markets to reliance on the labor of enslaved people.
So unfortunately, even after the abolishment of slavery, a lot of historians would equate the job force as the new era of slavery. And I'm certainly not a historian particular to the progress of that era, but in my opinion, the workforce that was created into the 19th century was certainly under contract. It was temporal as opposed to just the horridness of the slave trade. and being locked in to servitude. But a lot of people argue that it was sometimes about opportunity, giving people jobs in the factories, but there was quite a lot of significant negativity associated with that workforce. So it certainly evolved past slavery, but it was kind of a new type of slavery, in my opinion. But again, I'm certainly not a historian when it comes to that progress of American history, specifically when it comes to agricultural prosperity. You know, a bit of slavery hung on. I mean, it was a slow transition, and there were exceptions to that abolition. But early farms had a lot of trouble transitioning sometimes beyond human labor, and that's why it shifted to quite a lot of farm technology. So historians will often kind of describe it as, you know, for a while with slavery, it was all about human power on the farms. You know, they were doing all the work, and then it shifted to a lot of animals, you know, in fact, it evolved to not only horses, but mules in New England because they drank less water. So there was a bit of resiliency when it came to, again, that animal breeding, animal husbandry, to get away from relying on the slaves, mostly. You know, there was quite a lot of arguments against, you know, that transition. So again, it did happen slowly, even after the revolution. But it definitely shifted to more reliance on animals, more reliance on machinery by the 19th century. So less and less humans were relied on, with exception, on the farms. That kind of shifted them out of that era, if that makes sense. What else was part of that question?
So actually, another kind of related question is, which apothecaries were operating in 1802?
So I actually have the timeline right here. Pardon me. I can actually accurately answer that information. My trusty resource here. So most of them existed by the mid-19th century. I just want to answer that specifically because I don't actually, unless Nancy wants to chime in, she does quite a bit of this research. Okay, found it. So one of the first ones that existed, according to this book, was actually after 1802. So I may have misspoke through the presentation. We know that there was house calls associated with apothecary products, but I believe a lot of the initial apothecary store owners may have been operating out of their households. We actually kind of speculate that on John Jackson, who built the Shapiro House. So John Jackson was also one of the original physicians in the 18th century. So second part of the 1700s, there was quite a few of these physicians establishing these types of products and chemistry. A lot of physicians did not have chemistry backgrounds, though. They were surgeons. So at first, there was a dichotomy between people who were often familiar with concoctions, apothecary from Europe. So at first, a lot of those products were bought in, associated with the physicians utilizing them, but the true experts on making them were more to do with what we think of as a chemist or pharmacist today. So people that had more of the skills with chemistry, as opposed to the physicians who had more experience with anatomy. So eventually that merged together with modern medicine, but for a while it was separate. So if there wasn't actual apothecary shops in 1802, the doctors at least had resources accessing probably mostly apothecary shops that existed in Europe, or people at least selling those products or allowing people to access them through trade. But to really specifically answer the question, the first one was Jay Hubbard and I think Nathaniel Pierce at 4 Market Street. And that store opened by 1810. So, if not 1802, right afterwards. So if I misspoke on apothecary shops being actually open in 1802, I apologize.
I have a question for Eponine. So how has it been for you conducting your research remotely this summer? Can you talk to us about that experience?
Yeah, sure. I think it's a very good experience by far. So the biggest advantage is that the library, like in our university, is not really open, and like I have very limited resources to access. So like I can't really do like many of the research, because it's very limited books that you can check out, and then very limited online resources. So yeah, I kind of hope I could be at Portsmouth, and then I will have more like library access probably, or that kind of resource. But other than that, I think I still learned a lot, especially in the medicinal plants research, and Erik is very good at communication, and we did talk a lot about our research like twice a week. So I think it's a good amount of meeting schedule, like for keeping up with each other. And yeah, I really think it's a very good remote internship experience.
I see one more question that just came in, everyone. Is there any documentation on early apothecary people learning from our Native American practitioners? Perhaps new immigrants from Europe? Absolutely, but more to do with the oral tradition of learning. Quite a lot of practitioners were learning early on from Native Americans by word of mouth or just observing practice. There was actually early apprenticeship programs here in Portsmouth, certainly after the colonial period, more evolving into the 19th century when people were opening up their doors and teaching people, mostly through oral history and a few texts on teaching people who wanted to accumulate more of those apothecary skills here in Portsmouth. But absolutely in the beginning, lots of knowledge was absorbed from the Native Americans into European culture. Like I said, well, maybe I didn't mention this. Many Europeans arrived here, thinking that they could survive with seasonality and ecology here in New England, just as the Native Americans had survived for centuries. Just did not happen. They arrived not with the feasible skills to really survive. A lot of people starved to death, but slowly but surely people realized that ecology and learning. Well, one of the big problems was the Native Americans were moving around quite a bit. They had extreme resiliency, moving with the seasons, moving with the animals, moving with the resources. Europeans settled and they stayed put, most of all. The resources ran out and they didn't do much until the cash crops like tobacco and cotton really kind of kicked things off when it comes to prosperity in the colonial period. So yes, absolutely. Native Americans and Europeans were learning from each other beyond quite a lot of unrest, to say the least. It's a good question. Does anyone else have feedback, maybe some experiences with virtual engagement, this virtual internship? We're certainly always curious on how to enhance these programs, enhance the virtual internships. We may do this again in the future, but really any feedback and certainly any connections to resiliency today. Is everyone gardening, for instance, right now? You could just shake your head if you are. Yeah? Does everyone collect their own seed to sustain their own resources with those few connections I mentioned? Sometimes a little tricky.
Erik, actually, along the lines of seeds, I was wondering if you could provide everyone instructions with for if they receive the mysterious imported seed packets in the mail.
Oh yeah.
People have been receiving it across the country. In fact, I just received my packet today.
Oh really?
Yeah.
So I hope everyone has heard about this news story that is interesting but kind of scary. My suggestion, whenever you receive seed that you don't know where it's coming from, you don't know who has sent it to you, you see unfamiliar writing on an envelope, just like filtering phone calls, you know, with scammers, it's a scam. And it could be a scary scam. I mean, I'm not going to fearmonger much about this story, but let's just think of residues coming from other countries. You know, we're not the greatest country when it comes to pesticide use, but for over the years, we've banned quite a few of pesticides like DDT and other things, but other countries use chemicals that are banned in this country. So at the very least, let's think of residues on plant material coming in, and then we're touching everything, especially during these challenging times where we're trying to control what we touch. Anything and everything can be sent through the mail without, you know, some protocols in place. And my curiousness is, you know, how is all this seed arriving to everyone at this point? Because this is quite the big story right now. I've only read briefly this story, saw a few pictures of people actually like opening the envelopes. Just think of like dust and other things. So it's not just what's topically on plant material. Sometimes it's dust and airborne kind of things. So pesticides are not only sprays, they're also powders. They're also aerosols. They're also within the chemistry of the plant. So they could just be taken systematically through that plant, and now the seed is holding certain chemicals. So you just have to be very careful. But my best suggestion is, if you don't know where it's coming from or who it's from, or you didn't order it, don't even open it. Just like junk mail. It's just junk mail, really, to say the least.
Good advice. And I'm about to message everyone in case you receive one of these packets. As Erik said, don't open it, and contact the New Hampshire Department of Agriculture. I'm about to send out the information. So if you do, like me, receive one of these, you'll know what to do.
And we just had a really good message. Isn't it important not to throw those seeds in the trash? Yes. I mean, people pick things out of the trash all the time. Let's just say that this like goes into some terrestrial ecosystem and these seeds actually start growing somewhere. So it's a good point. I'm not sure where else we could dispose. It's almost like a battery. You want to dispose things like a battery in a separate location or something. I'm not sure, but that's a good point. Just reading a few more messages, everyone. I guess there's, oh, that's your message, Jessica, thank you. Instructions. I guess there's instructions by the USDA, Department of Agriculture. There's a few protocols online already if you receive these seeds, and inform USDA. So I assume that's just all online, keeping people in check and just kind of coordinating what's wrong right now with these seeds coming in. Just bizarre. I mean, this whole year is just bizarre, everyone, right? Just trying to think. Nancy Hammond, who's on the line, who does quite a bit of our research at the Athenaeum. That's our historic library, similar to the Boston Athenaeum, I'm sure, Maddy. Nancy says, I understand that Dr. John Jackson had his house built and established his apothecary garden there, just near the Walsh House. So that's an interesting point. So again, that house is where we interpret the Jewish American family, the Shapiro family. So John Jackson living in that house, I believe building it in the 18th century. And Nancy believes that he had a garden there as well. That's interesting. Thank you, Nancy. Well, unless there's additional questions, I think that basically wraps things up. I'd be happy to talk more. I'd be happy to answer any additional questions. The gardens are looking beautiful these days. The chickens are happy. I want to thank everyone for joining the program today. This was fun. This was kind of brand new for us. We hope to do more of these programs in the future. And certainly any feedback, maybe via email or on social media. We're just always curious on your impressions on how we can enhance these programs for the community, for the public.